Thank you, Alessandro, and dear colleagues, dear friends, good morning, everybody. I'm pleased to welcome you all together with Governor Visco to this international conference on climate change. Those of you who have been with us over the last couple of days already know how high climate issues feature on the agenda of our G20 presidency. Friday, we heard interesting ideas at the symposium on tax policies and climate change. Yesterday, in the G20 meeting, we continued the discussion on global policies for a green recovery and on the role of the financial system in promoting a just transition. Climate change is a concrete threat to people, planet, and prosperity. I believe Venice is a perfect representation of the beauty of our planet, but also of its vulnerability to climate and nature. Since the very beginning of its history, Venice has had to carefully preserve the lagoon, even moving the flow of some rivers, 3 rivers actually, out of the lagoon to protect its fragile environment. Now the entire world has become vulnerable to our activities, and we need to protect our ecosystem before it is too late. A positive fact is that the debate on climate issue has become increasingly relevant in the international policy agenda. Such a recognition has pushed many governments to announce net zero goals to be achieved by mid-century. Nevertheless, to actually reach net zero targets, we need immediate concrete actions. Postponing the adjustment needed will only make them more challenging, perhaps too challenging and sudden. This would in turn generate shocks and financial stability risks. The current political and economic juncture give us an opportunity in this sense. We can steer the recovery and take the bold measure needed to support a just transition. The green transition should not be seen as an obstacle, but rather as an asset for our recovery strategies. By supporting quality investment in sustainable infrastructure and innovative clean technologies, we can boost productivity, foster a resilient growth, and promote a shared prosperity. The transition to carbon neutrality will not be an easy journey. We all know that. Reorienting our economies entails costs in the short run. To prevent a disorderly transition, we need a comprehensive strategy. We should also build our choices on solid analytical frameworks, identify the most efficient and appropriate tools for reducing emissions. At the same time, we need to ensure a just transition, a transition where no one is left behind. Tackling climate change is a global challenge which calls for coordinated policy action. It is also a challenge that requires the mobilization of considerable resources. The international financial community and private sector should actively participate to support the achievement of the Paris Agreement objectives. Finally, differences across countries in terms of fiscal pace and access to financial markets should be taken into account. In conclusion, we need a comprehensive strategy. This is why we convened today the most relevant global actors to discuss and coordinate their respective actions to support the achievement of the Paris Agreement goals. We have structured the conference in 2 main sessions. In the morning session, we will discuss the policies to address climate change and to support the transition in emerging markets and developing economies. Then, in the afternoon, we will focus on the initiative to mitigate the climate-related financial risks, to gather valuable data to assess risks, and the carbon footprint of projects and investment, as well as to seek the engagement of the private financial sector. I look forward to hearing the views of our distinguished speakers on these crucial topics. So, without further ado, I will leave the stage to Ignacio to introduce the keynote speaker, Professor William Nordhaus, whom I thank for having accepted our invitation.
Well, thank you very much, Daniele. Welcome to you all. It is a great honor for me to have Bill Nordhaus opening this Venice International Conference on Climate Change. Obviously, Professor Nordhaus needs no introduction, especially to the people who are here today, and there is certainly not enough time to list all his many academic achievements. But please indulge me in sharing with you a couple of personal memories about his work. In the early 1970s, I was studying for my PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, and I came to know an influential NBR paper that Bill Nordhaus wrote with Jim Tobin on whether GNP, at the time we used this gross national product, now we talk about GDP, and considering whether that was an obsolete measure of economic progress. Only a few years had passed since Bob Kennedy had famously asserted that GDP measures almost everything except those which make life worthwhile. But Nordhaus and Tobin really accurately examined several corrections, taking into account non-market activities, the environmental pollution and others, and other leisure and other items that are not normally measured and accounted for in GNP or GDP. And they concluded at the end that GNP, albeit imperfect, still provided a relevant picture of the way the economy performs and of economic growth, and a conclusion that most, I think, economists today would subscribe, certainly policymakers. Now, during the same years, Professor Nordhaus recognized early on the weaknesses of a report that was commissioned by the Club of Rome. I remember that because I was distributing this report in Rome just after my graduation in 71, 72. And it was interesting because the limits to growth, that was the report, pointed out the flaws of gloomy scenarios. Pointed out that there were risks that, unless it was corrected, a gloomy scenario would have taken place. A scenario which predicted an imminent depletion of natural resources. Nordhaus observed rather correctly that this depletion was largely based on the extrapolation of the trends. They were engineers. They were basically putting together trends and trying to understand whether limits would have been reached under this extrapolation. But they did not take sufficiently in consideration the role of markets, the rebalancing power of prices, the servo mechanisms, and the nature of technological change that takes place endogenously, often as a response to market failures. And in particular, when the resources used in production became scarcer, an increase in prices discourages demand. Higher prices subsequently provide an incentive to develop new production methods that utilize less of these resources. A few years later, Professor Nordhaus, however, understood, perhaps much earlier than others, that indeed there are limits to economic growth. But these limits arise not much, perhaps not only from depletion of natural resources, but mostly from the limited capacity of the atmosphere to absorb the greenhouse gases generated by human activities. And in 1992, we provided all of us with an important quantitative tool, which was called the DICE, the Dynamic Integrated Climate Economy Model, that compared benefits of action against climate change with the costs of inaction. In his recent Nobel Prize lecture, Professor Nordhaus convincingly argued that climate change is a particularly thorny externality due to its global nature. And this puts it outside the domain not only of markets, but also of national governments. It is really a global problem. And so we wonder today how the global community can overcome this environmental standoff. It is a challenge that calls for coordinated action across countries, and this is the main reason why we, this year, have put the fight against climate change at the center of our G20 presidency. To conclude, in the last few years, there have been proposals by Professor Nordhaus, some really thought-provoking response to the challenge of climate change, with the establishment of a climate club in which somehow those who do not belong to the club may have to pay and therefore there is an incentive to join the club to avoid trade penalties. It is obviously a proposal that has several technical, economic, geopolitical difficulties, but the issue really is without a mechanism like this or similar tools, there may be free riding in the reduction of carbon emissions. People, countries will wait for others to act, and in waiting nobody most likely acts. So the issue is what kind of pragmatic way forward do we have or we may design to arrest climate change. Professor Nordhaus will help us to keep this debate open, avoiding any hasty, I hope, dismissal of potentially useful policies. So I would close expressing my hope that the G20 will contribute to fostering a broad agreement on the necessary steps, and that the next COP26 in Glasgow will succeed in transforming good intentions, like the ones we have today, into concrete actions. And let us now hear from Professor Nordhaus himself. I'm very grateful for you having accepted to be here today with us. Thank you, please.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here in this beautiful spot. Many of you who've been here have heard people remark on the beauty and the history of Venice, and I'd just like to give you my own view of it. Venice flies, if you're in Venice, you fly under 3 flags. The first flag is the flag of Venice. And Venice, among many things, is remarkable as having the longest lived democracy of any major polity in the world. The democracy in Venice, until it was interrupted by Napoleon, lived 500 years. And that's a worthy achievement. The second flag that we fly under here when we're in Venice is the flag of Italy. And the flag of Italy is important for many things, but for what we're doing today, it's important because Italy was the home of the first universities. And although universities in the early days were perhaps not what they are today, universities have evolved into institutions of independent thinking, of science, social, natural, as well as humanities. And the reason that we have the kinds of knowledge about scientific and economic affairs that we do today is because of the rise of these great universities. And the final flag in Venice is the flag of the EU. And the EU is also another important institution, as really the major multinational institution today with power over many nations. And all 3 of those are put together because those are an inspiration for the kinds of policies and thinking we need as we go forward to deal with climate change. What I'd like to do today is talk about 4 issues. The first one is what I'll call the state of the world in terms of climate change policy. And all I'll do is show you a little on that there's been basically no improvement in in emissions over the last 3 decades. For all the talk and all the COPs and all the conferences of the parties, we've made very, very little progress in reducing the trend of emissions. I'll show you that first. Then you ask, why is that? And there are really 3 reasons. One is that a key ingredient in reducing emissions is high carbon prices. High prices on CO2 emissions. While it's true that in the EU you have a relatively high prices on CO2 emissions, it only covers part of the economy, and it only covers a very small part of the world. So globally, prices are still very low. Secondly, we suffer from inadequate investment in low-carbon technologies because of the externalities there. So there's a kind of another externality in addition to the climate externality, which is the knowledge externality. And finally, Ignacio mentioned at the end, our chair, the problem of free riding, and that countries are free riding on the actions of others, and because of the free riding, that has undermined our climate agreements. So those are the 3 points that I'd like to, one is an overview point about where we stand, and the other 3 is about the policies that are necessary and ones on which we're falling short. This is the first figure I'll show you, and this basically shows what's happened with respect to decarbonization since 1990 through 2019. I go through 2019 because that's the last year when we have data that looks reliable. After that, the pandemic has mucked up all the data. And so what this shows is what's the carbon intensity of global production. That's to say CO2 emissions, industrial CO2 emissions, divided by global real GDP. And you can see there's a straight line there, which is the red line, which is declining at 1.8% per year. And then you have the dotted blue line, which shows the actual numbers, the actual intensity. This excludes China because China is so big and has had such different trends that it tends to distort the aggregate data. And what you can see from this is there's been basically no break in the trend over the last 30 years. So even with the agreements of Kyoto, going back to the Framework Convention in the early 1990s, the Kyoto Treaty in 1997, the Copenhagen Accord, the Paris Accord, you can see virtually no change in the trend of decarbonization. That trend line would have to turn very, very sharply down if we were going to meet our objectives. I'll show those in a second, but I would like to emphasize that this trend, accompanied with 3 or 4% GDP growth, means that CO2 emissions are rising. But this is the key trend to look at if you want to know the effectiveness of policies. Now the next, so this is the first and key item that I'd like to talk about. I'll talk about the reasons for this in a minute, but this is the key thing that you need to take into account when you look at how far our various conferences of the parties and the way we've gone up to date, how well they have worked. Now, the key point I'd like to next point is that policies are inadequate for our international objectives. And to do this, I'll show you, I'm sorry, I need to go back. I'll show you the emissions going back to 2015 and the latest through 2019, and then the projections according to climate modelers of emissions, CO2 emissions going forward. So emissions in 2019 were around 53 or 54 billion tons of CO2 equivalent per year. This includes non-CO2 gases as well. And with current policies, that's to say virtually no policies, as I'll talk about later, that will grow slowly 1 or 2% per year over the coming decades. It will not turn down, but will continue to grow according to current projections. Current policy that has been agreed upon in the Paris Accord has national policies. These are voluntary policies, but they're policies that countries, virtually all countries, have agreed to. And in the middle line there, in the blue line, it shows through 2030 what countries have actually agreed to. And then after 2030, assuming the same degree of tightening. But we don't need to go beyond 2030 to get the major point, which is that even with the Paris Accord, and this is assuming countries meet their obligations under the Paris Accord, there will be basically emissions will basically be flat over the next 20 years. There will be very, very little improvement in emissions if countries meet their obligations under the Paris Accord. The final line at the bottom there shows you a run that estimates what emissions would need to be if we were to meet the international target of 2 degrees C. And that would have this is one that meets it efficiently. It's not the only one, but it's one that meets it in a way that's cost effective at minimum cost. And that would involve a sharp decline in emissions. And if you look, you can see around 2050, it gets to 0 net emissions of CO2 equivalent. This is global emissions, including non-CO2 greenhouse gases. But the main point is that that would involve a very sharp and steep drop in emissions and emissions intensity to reach the 2-degree target. As you can see, even if countries meet the Paris Accord, they will be only a fraction of the way to meeting the international objectives, and there are also questions about whether those will be met. So there are 3 policy issues that need to be discussed. There are 3 ingredients to meeting our objectives. One is carbon pricing, the other is technology, and the third is international agreements. So let's start with carbon prices. It's been well known for many years that high prices on CO2 emissions is a key and really a necessary ingredient in carbon policy. It's not sufficient, but it is necessary. And it's a key to sharp emissions reductions. A second point, which is not quite so obvious, is that the level of price, of the carbon price, of the emissions price, needs to be harmonized to meet the objectives. By harmonization, I mean harmonized across countries. We could say equalized if you like, but harmonized is a less ambitious goal, and also needs to be harmonized across sectors. So you can't have some sectors, say motor fuels, with very, very high carbon prices, and other sectors, such as electricity generation, with very low carbon prices. So a key ingredient is that the level of price should be harmonized across countries and should be high. But the fact, as I'll show you in a minute, is that prices, carbon prices, emission prices, and the regimes under which they operate, the structures under which they operate, are highly fragmented. If you were to reach the target of 2 degrees C, that would require a uniform, or at least average price, effective price, somewhere between $50 and $150 per ton of CO2. But if you look at the calculations of the actual carbon price that have been prepared by the World Bank, the average carbon price in 2019 was about $2 per ton of CO2. So 2 instead of 50 to 100. So that shows one reason why policies have been so ineffective is because carbon prices are so low. I show you next a picture of what I call the carbon price landscape from the World Bank. This is from the World Bank report, and it's a kind of collage. It's a collage of policies of different countries. And what it shows on the horizontal axis, there are 2 things it shows. On the horizontal axis, it shows the share of emissions that are covered by a regime. And on the vertical axis, it shows the carbon price of the regime. So you look, there's the large green bubble in the middle, the lower middle. That's the European trading scheme, which is the largest trade and also multinational trading scheme. And it covers, there are two things about it that you note. It's very large, or a third, I guess. But one is that the price is relatively low. It's been as low as $5 and as high as $50 a ton. But in this period, it was a little under $20 a ton. But more important is it only covers a fraction of the economy, less than half of the European economy. So you can see other, if you can see that, you can see other countries around the world. You can see on the right, there are countries with there are regions. The right dot there is has a very high coverage rate and a very low tax. That's the Quebec cap and trade and the California cap and trade. And then off the map, it isn't really shown. You have Sweden and Switzerland with very high prices but very low coverage. Just to be clear, if you were, I'm going to superimpose on this what you would need. That pink dot there shows you what you'd need to meet your objectives. You need 100% coverage, and you need a very high price. Right? You need all the countries to have 100% coverage or nearly 100% coverage, and you'd also need a very high price. And you can see in the background there what reality is, that none of the countries have high prices and 100% coverage. And again, this only shows the countries with coverage, and 80% of the emissions are actually at 0-0. Countries like the United States and other countries. So the point here, I would just emphasize, is that carbon prices are a key to climate change policy, but they're fragmented and they're low. So a second policy area is one that's necessary, perhaps not emphasized so much because people have focused on carbon prices, but in a way just as important. To reach our objectives, we're going to have a major technological transformation in the energy sector. We're going to have to replace many of the technologies that we now use with new technologies. But just as there's a climate externality, there's also a technological externality, because the public returns on green innovation are much larger than the private returns on green innovation. There's a double externality here, because there's already a gap between the public and private returns to innovation, because the inventors only get a small fraction of the returns. But in addition to that, the fact that the returns are underpriced because carbon emissions are underpriced lead to a double externality. So this means there's inadequate research and development in green technologies. And you can use as examples carbon capture and sequestration, for which there's basically no economic incentive to undertake it now. Advanced nuclear, which is already extremely expensive and does not have any advantage over fossil fuels because of low carbon prices. And hydrogen usage in various sectors, and hydrogen technology, which is also currently very expensive, needs vast expenses of R&D and subsidies of R&D, but won't get it as long as there's no carbon pricing and no incentives. So the policies here are two. One is that you can already improve the incentives by carbon pricing. If you have high carbon prices, then already green technologies and low carbon technologies will have an advantage that they don't have now. So carbon pricing is not just an incentive in terms of trying to get people to reduce their use, but it's also just as important an incentive inducing innovation in low carbon technologies. And in addition to that, we need enhanced incentives at the level of our governments, our fiscal incentives, and intellectual property incentives for low-carbon technologies. I will just give you one example of misplaced priorities in our governmental research budgets, and that is the misplaced priority of the U.S. federal R&D, research and development. I might have asked you whether you thought we spend more on energy R&D or defense R&D. I've asked this before, and people usually don't know. But the fact is, as you can see here, there's a vast misplaced priority in terms of federal research and development. Weapons and nuclear weapons and security, and this was back in 2018 budget, had almost $60 billion of federal research and development, whereas advanced energy and renewables had only $2 billion. And that has not changed very much since 2018. The real priority is we need to get that right bar way up. We need to increase dramatically in all of our technologically advanced countries the investment in green technologies. And these are federal subsidies, federal research and development tax credits, and other elements. Final point I'd like to make is the problem of free riding and how free riding undermines international climate agreements. I think it's a painful realization, but I think we need to face that our international climate policy, the approach we're taking, is at a dead end. We've gone through all these 26 conferences of the parties, and we're still with voluntary agreements. And voluntary agreements are hampered by free riding. All of our climate agreements to date, back to the Framework Convention, through the Kyoto Protocol, through the Paris Accord, are voluntary. Countries agree to take steps, but there are no penalties if they don't take the steps. Under the Kyoto Protocol, when the US withdrew, there were no penalties. When Canada withdrew, there were no penalties. There are no penalties for non-participation, and there are no penalties for not meeting your goals. Now, you might say, what's the problem with that? Well, the problem with that is that countries under this free riding possibility will fail to reduce emissions or fail to keep commitments to reduce emissions in a costly fashion. And for those of you who have been involved in other areas, it's very similar to the race to the bottom in global corporate taxation, where we've seen the very sharp reduction in corporate taxes as companies race to the tax shelters. And it's a very similar kind of problem trying to face it, that there's a kind of free rider problem as long as there's no incentives and there's no penalties for countries not to reduce their corporate tax. So one proposal, which was mentioned earlier, is what I've called a climate club to overcome free riding. And what we see as we look at the history of international agreements, such as the World Trade Organization, is that effective agreements require incentives. They require carrots and sticks. They require countries to make promises, to make commitments, but they also require consequences if they don't keep their commitments. And this is the same thing that we need with a climate treaty, which we don't have with any of the current climate treaties or the current proposals. And here's just an example. You can think of others, but this is one that we have studied and modeled, been modeled in different places, Yale and other universities. You might start with a target price, which is the obligation of countries is that they have a minimum domestic carbon price. They can meet whichever way they want, cap and trade or carbon tax, but they have to meet a minimum carbon price, rising over time. And then there's a penalty on non-participants and people who don't meet the obligations of something like a penalty tariff. And for these examples, I've used a uniform tariff, which is much simpler to administer than a countervailing duty. The modeling we've done at Yale and at other universities suggests that this approach, this very approach of a minimum carbon price of, say, $50 a ton or $100 a ton, and I'll say a modest uniform penalty on non-participants of 3 to 5% would actually induce participation, widespread participation by different countries. So if I can summarize then, just to come back to the 4 points I started with, there's been very little progress on slowing warming. There's been lots of policies and lots of steps and lots of conferences, but if you look at the proof of the pudding, as they say, if you look at the actual key element, which is emissions intensity has declined at about the same rate over the last 10 years as it did the 10 years before that and the 10 years before that. We need to see a downturn in that decarbonization, and we have not seen it to date. A first central goal of policy needs to be high and harmonized carbon prices. And this would be high prices starting at least at $50 a ton, perhaps rising sharply after that, harmonized across countries and across sectors. One of the elements, third point, one of the elements that's been underemphasized is the importance of low-carbon technologies and the fact that there's underinvestment in those, partly because of low-carbon prices, partly because the governments have not put the kind of support into those sectors that are needed given its priority. And finally, effective international policies require some kind of club structure, some kind of structure where you have carrots and sticks along with carrots, I should say, where you have incentives for countries to participate. So countries participate because it's in their interest to participate, not because they're being lectured to participate or being cajoled or coerced to participate. So a club type of structure would be approach to that. Thank you very much.
Yes. Hello. So, thank once again Professor Nordhaus for his insightful keynote speech. I think the message to global policymakers is clear and leaves no doubt. Our announcements on carbon neutrality should be followed by concrete action. And I see the similarity to the issue of global corporate taxation. International financial institutions have been at the forefront on the global climate action. They play a crucial role in stimulating the policy debate, suggesting policies, coordinating efforts by NDBs and other international institutions. Today, they will contribute to frame and animate our discussion on climate change and on policies for a just transition and sustainable recovery. Over the past few months, the staff of the fund and of the bank have been working alongside Italian colleagues to underpin the conference with solid analysis and policy proposals. In particular, the IMF staff coordinated a group of experts which focused on global climate policies. As I said in my introduction earlier, the transformation of our economies and societies calls for the adoption of a comprehensive policy mix, including a package of public investment and policies for a just transition. Strategic green investments, specific market-based mechanisms, including carbon pricing instruments to incentivize low-carbon production and consumption, effective measures to mitigate the adverse impact of the transition on vulnerable groups should all be key pillars of this strategy. Kristalina, will guide us through this topic. In doing so, she may also add something on tax policies and climate change. On this crucial, yet still very sensitive issue, we hosted together a G20 high-level tax symposium on tax policy and climate change a couple of days ago, where we discussed the effectiveness of tax policy in tackling climate change while mitigating economic and social costs of the transition borne by citizens and businesses. Alongside, World Bank colleagues coordinated a working group focusing on supporting the climate transition in emerging markets and developing economies. The global transition will be successful, fair and just if all countries participate. International financial institutions, multilateral, regional, national and other development banks have a key role to play in supporting climate action in vulnerable contexts. The World Bank is increasingly called to take the leadership in enhancing coordination among multilateral development banks in order to accelerate the full alignment of their operation with the Paris Agreement, as well as to maximize the collective impact of their action. MDBs play a crucial role in providing financial and technical resources to pursue a global, sustainable and resilient recovery. Most importantly, such institutions are critical to leverage private finance while supporting the creation of a credible pipeline of investment projects for mitigation, adaptation and resilience. This is essential to catalyze innovation and create an investment-friendly environment in vulnerable contexts. In light of this, I look forward to hear more from David about the joint MDB proposals aimed at supporting countries in the preparation and implementation of long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies and at tackling barriers to larger-scale private investment in climate projects. Kristalina, you have the floor now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. I could not be more grateful to the Italian presidency for bringing us together today and starting us with Professor Nordhaus' presentation. For the benefit of full disclosure, I am a trained environmental economist. I have been studying your research, and I think it will show in what I have to say right now. So where do we start? We have to keep global temperatures below rising 1.5 to 2% level. To get to that point, we have to cut global emissions by 1/4 to 1/2 over the next decade. Based on our historical experience, as we saw in the slides, this may seem an impossible target, but it is one we ought to and we can achieve with public support, technological breakthroughs, and yes, the right policies. Our miserable performance so far has given ground to an interesting joke. How can we achieve sustainability and protect our climate? And the answer is there are two ways to do that. One is realistic and the other one is fantastic. The realistic way is extraterrestrials come from space, they take over our affairs, they do it. And the fantastic is we people, we do it ourselves. So your job as a presidency is to make the fantastic realistic. And we are here to help you do so. Why I think there is a pathway forward? First, because public awareness has gone up significantly. Recent global poll tells us that majority of people surveyed consider climate change a global emergency, with the level of concern highest in small island and developing states and in high-income countries at 74 and 72% accordingly, and well above 50% of people in middle-income and least developed countries also believe this is the case, 62 and 58%. Another poll tells us that during the pandemic, this concern has gone up. And actually, many of us worried it would be the opposite. But actually, people saw the pandemic as a reminder that we need to step up climate action. 43% of people surveyed recently said, we are more concerned now. Only 7% said we are less concerned. We also have seen during the pandemic the response of science being so powerful. We got vaccines in record times. We saw the response of policymakers being unprecedented in terms of fiscal and monetary policy action. And it is in this context, staff from several institutions came together and we worked on key policy priorities to cut emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. And actually, I agree with Professor Nordhaus. It has to go beyond the Paris Agreement if we were to protect ourselves from being literally, well, basically being literally cooked. So, first priority, and I would echo what we just heard, make market signals work for the new climate economy, not against it. As politically challenging this may be, the world needs to get rid of all forms of fossil fuel subsidies. And if we define them broadly, not only direct subsidies, but also undercharging for supplies, environmental and health costs, they are equivalent to more than $5 trillion annually. And we are coming up with new research that would present the exact composition of these subsidies. And obviously, key is what we just heard from Professor Nordhaus, to put a robust price on carbon, as we actually discussed also at the tax symposium. To create that critical signal to redirect private investment and innovation to clean technology, to incentivize energy efficiency. And our research is very clear. We simply cannot reach our goal of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius without carbon price. And this signal needs to be predictably getting stronger, reaching by 2030 an average global price of $75 a ton. Way up from where we are. And actually, Professor Nordhaus, a little piece of good news. With increased coverage from 18 to 23% of carbon emissions that are priced, it went from $2 a ton to $3 a ton. Now, we can say, hooray, 50% higher, or we can say, well, that is 25 times lower than it should be by 2030. A minimal first step on carbon pricing is a regular stock-taking of measures by the G20 countries to assess progress towards mitigation commitments. But we do believe we have to achieve a higher level of ambition, and you have heard me talking about that, introducing an international carbon price floor agreement among major emitters. It is very much in line with the price club we just heard about. What the difference is that what it presents is an opportunity to calibrate 4 different categories of countries where the carbon price floor is now and how we go up. And I do believe that emerging markets, developing countries would not join unless there is this recognition that we are not equal, either by contribution to the problem or by the way we get out of it. With a pragmatic design, this type of arrangement would allow different minimum prices based on different development levels and different national policy approaches. And the carbon price floor does not have to be a tax. It could be cap and trade, or it could be even a combination of fee-based and regulations that produce the equivalency of that carbon price at sectoral and national level. And crucially, as we are making global mitigation efforts more effective, this price floor would address concerns about competitiveness that are already insensitizing carbon border adjustments. In our view, they are less effective and more divisive. But carbon pricing alone is not enough. It brings me to the second policy priority, green investments. Radically decarbonizing our economies will require a substantial scaling up of investments over the next 2 decades. The shift to renewables, new electricity networks, energy efficiency, low carbon mobility offers huge investment opportunities and a huge opportunity for green growth and green jobs. Our research shows that deficit-financed green supply policies could raise global GDP by about 2% this decade and create millions of new jobs. On average, around 30% of new investments have to come from public sources, the remaining 70% from private sources. And that means giving priority to green recovery packages, green budgeting, and green finance. And of course, international institutions have a role to play to reduce both costs and perceived risks. And I know that David would talk about it, so I would skip and go straight to the third priority. Professor Nordhaus didn't talk about it, but I will, and it is just transition within countries and across countries. Within countries, we must recognize decarbonization will impact vulnerable households, poor people, as well as businesses and workers currently deployed in sectors with high emissions. Fair compensation measures will be required. For example, revenues from carbon pricing could fund cash transfers, social safety nets, worker retraining, relocation schemes. And place-based policies can help develop new low-carbon industries and jobs through green investments. And across countries, we have to recognize we need to help the developing world. And this 100 billion a year that we are talking about, they must happen. And if they don't happen, there would be not only loss in momentum, but loss of trust, erosion of trust. And then these agreements that we talk about, they would be much harder to reach. Let me finish with us at the fund. We work very closely with partners on this agenda. With the bank, we formed a high-level advisory group on sustainable and inclusive development for policy analysis and proposals, concrete proposals down to country level to move the world forward. We are putting climate at the heart of our work, from country, regional and global economic surveillance to capacity building to helping small island states with fiscal strategies that build resilience. Our board gave us a hand to cover climate in Article 4 and financial sector assessment programs. We would do it, mitigation for large emitters, adaptation for vulnerable countries, and of course transition for countries with high carbon intensity economies. And earlier this year, we launched the new climate change indicator dashboard. We very much embrace the data gap initiative because good data lead to good policies. Now, beyond surveillance, you would say, put your money where your mouth is. And what we are now working on is considering with our membership whether the 650 billion of special drawing rights can give us an opportunity to move more financing in the right direction. We are exploring the creation of resilience and sustainability trust to support resilient and sustainable growth in the post-pandemic period, including resilience to climate change, lending at cheaper rates and longer maturities to provide fiscal space for countries to undertake green reforms and policies. And it could, especially for benefit low-income countries, poorer and vulnerable middle-income countries. And I look forward to discussing this with you. Leonardo da Vinci, since you talk about Venice, Leonardo da Vinci, who worked in Venice, said, "I have been impressed with the urgency of doing. Knowing is not enough. We must apply. being willing is not enough. We must do. And I think today, hopefully, we get this sense of, yes, we can. And to prove Professor Nordhaus' graph wrong, because it is going to turn the way you describe it, it should. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kristalina. Now, David.
Thank you very much, Daniela, and thank you, Ignacio, for the opening remarks, and to both of you for hosting. Thank you also to Professor Nordhaus for laying the stage, and Kristalina for those very interesting remarks. Our collective responses to poverty, inequality, and climate change are defining choices of our age. We must tackle them together to make progress on our mission of reducing poverty and boosting shared prosperity. The COVID-19 pandemic and economic losses have been devastating. We're providing maximum support to developing economies to respond to the crisis, and we're also working to help them recover in ways that will be sustainable, greener, and more prosperous. I've been very happy with the World Bank Group performance over the last 15 months, the 15 months of the pandemic, and our data shows that we've been able to mobilize and provide $157 billion in support over that 15-month period. So that's a record and a 60% growth over the previous 15 months. Much of the hard work ahead will have to be done at the country level. At the World Bank Group, we're making the GRID approach, green, resilient, and inclusive development, operational through multidisciplinary expertise. Mari Pangestu is here with me today as Managing Director in that part of the bank. Financing and support for implementation. Axel van Trotzenberg is here today with me, the Managing Director for operations and for operations. While we're doing everything we can so people in poorer countries can benefit from good development and climate outcomes. In 2020, the bank group provided more climate finance than ever. We accounted for over half of multilateral climate finance to developing countries and over 2/3 of the adaptation finance. In 2021, we're delivering even more. Our Climate Change Action Plan for 21 through 25 dedicates an average 35% of bank group financing over the next 5 years to climate action, with at least half of bank financing supporting adaptation and resilience efforts. We are aligning bank group financing with the Paris Agreement goals. The crux of our second Climate Change Action Plan is to help developing countries integrate climate considerations into their development strategies and to deploy climate finance in ways that achieve the most results in terms of actual mitigation, reduction in greenhouse gases, and actual adaptation, saving lives. We will help client countries in their efforts to develop and implement the NDCs and long-term strategies. We're enhancing our core analytical products, such as our recently launched Country Climate and Development Reports and a facility on climate-informed public expenditure reviews. These all work together and are critical in getting the job done. We need diagnostics and a data-driven approach to help prioritize action. One key metric is the extent to which an intervention bends the trajectory of global greenhouse gas emissions. In this regard, we know we need to drive transformation in several key systems: energy, agriculture, food and water, land, transport, and manufacturing. Together, these systems generate over 90% of global greenhouse gas emissions and also face significant adaptation challenges. They are major contributors to economic growth and development, so there has to be an integration of climate and development goals and policies. Our action plan describes areas and techniques where we think countries and private sector clients can achieve impact and recognizes that the costs to manage these transitions will often be large compared to available resources. Our newly announced country climate and diagnostic reports, I'll call them CCDRs, will be an important tool to help us prioritize and sequence climate action in our client countries. They will investigate how climate change impacts a country's development path, and they will identify mitigation, adaptation, and resilience building to improve development outcomes. Over the next year, we plan to complete up to 25 of these CCDRs, focusing for the first round on developing countries with particularly large carbon emissions and/or great climate vulnerabilities. The world's poorest countries, those are our IDA borrowers, account for less than 1/10 of global greenhouse gas emissions, but they're the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, droughts, flooding, and coastal erosion. The majority of IDA countries' emissions, about 40% of them, come from agriculture sector, a sector that's not only the largest contributor to these countries' GDP, but one that underpins the livelihood of the poorest people. 80% of the world's poor reside in rural areas and rely on agriculture for their livelihood. At the same time, these countries have the lowest energy access levels and a weak manufacturing base. So we need to consider climate interventions for countries at different stages in their development. Some of the highest emitters need to achieve a just transition from coal and find ways to reduce emissions from heavy industry through new technologies such as carbon capture and storage. And for the poorest countries, as we continue to support sectors critical for their economic growth, we need to identify ways to help their growth and environmental practices become sustainable. As an example, $420 million climate-smart agriculture project we financed in Maharashtra, India, which supported 310,000 farmers in adopting climate-smart agricultural practices. The project is expected to reduce climate-related crop failures and eventually benefit 7 million people in a region prone to severe drought. As we scale up our financing and sharpen our focus on impact, we need equitable and practical ways to balance growth and climate imperatives. This is why in our action plan and as part of our commitment to align our financing flows with the goals of the Paris Agreement, we're increasing our support for countries to develop meaningful and impactful indices and LTSs that take into account their development needs. To date, we've already supported over 50 countries on their indices, from Mongolia to Mozambique and from Congo to Chile, and we're allocating more resources for this in coming years. We also need a parallel effort to protect our natural capital and biodiversity so that solutions work for people and the planet. Nature offers some of the best solutions to the climate crisis. Mangrove forests, for example, help sequester carbon and avoid over $80 billion a year in losses from coastal flooding. As climate change and desertification threaten livelihoods across the Sahel, the World Bank plans to invest over $5 billion over the next 5 years to help restore degraded landscapes and improve agricultural productivity in 11 countries on an expanse that stretches from Senegal to Djibouti. As a global community, we need to be willing to address some of the most challenging climate problems. For example, 250 or more gigawatts of coal-fired plants could come online in the near to medium term, mostly in Asia. Halting these and decommissioning existing polluting coal-fired plants will be expensive. Who will bear the cost and any losses? Almost 50% of global CO2 equivalent emissions come from the combined energy and heavy industry sectors in just China, the US, and India. How will transformations be incentivized and funded? If public companies decide to divest fossil fuel assets, will the assets simply move to new ownership? And if fossil fuel emitters are shuttered, how can we ensure that the raw material is not simply exported and emitted elsewhere? As the world works to develop low-carbon energy sources that are reliable, easily stored and deployed commercially and at scale, how do we support the poorest countries in achieving their energy access goals and SDG 7 for electricity access? And how can we mobilize and incentivize the private sector to engage in providing global public goods, for example, foregoing coal, or adaptation whose costs are incurred upfront, but whose benefits accrue over time. As I discussed in detail on Friday at our events, a key problem and challenge is how to change incentives in taxes and subsidies. Both Professor Nordhaus and Kristalina mentioned this. It's core. Carbon taxes and reduced subsidies have emerged as the most impactful explicit carbon pricing instrument, but this will require political will and consensus. Both the private and public sectors have important roles to play in providing answers. We need to tackle the low-hanging fruit, such as investing in climate-smart agriculture and livestock, better regulation for high-emitting second-hand vehicles, fleet management, investing in energy efficiency, among others, and supporting the enabling environment for bold ideas. Technological improvements, including energy efficiency, battery storage, hydrogen, nuclear developments, carbon storage, and decarbonization techniques will be important determinants for low-carbon transitions around the world. IFC and MIGA are mobilizing private sector financing and helping companies lower their emissions. A recent example is IFC's financing of one of the largest gas flaring reduction projects in the world in Iraq, where we mobilized 8 international banks to finance the world's first green loan dedicated to gas flaring reduction. And so, with that, in sum, I'm very pleased to be here today to affirm and reaffirm the World Bank Group's strong commitment to work with all stakeholders, public and private, to advance the integration of climate and development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Kristalina. Thank you for your contribution today and for all the work you are doing for the G20. Thanks a lot.